Ladies and gentlemen, the theme that I'm going to address is shift in water thinking, crucial for hunger alleviation in sub-Saharan Africa. Africa is suffering from major developing delays, as we can see from the two maps which we can see here. This is the continent where not only undernutrition culminates, but also the population growth is largest of all the different continents in the world. These are two characteristics which have strongly contributed to the designation of the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda to be achieved by 2030. Goal number 2 highlights hunger alleviation. A look on a biophysical world map shows us that Africa is completely different from the other continents except Australia. Both of the Americas are well endowed with both land and water. Africa, on the other hand, is more similar to Australia by having an arid climate and therefore being particularly poor in water, a key natural resource for both socioeconomic development and food production. I tend to think about Africa as a climate-wise giant Australia. That livelihood zones are hydroclimatically determined is of course nothing new to African agricultural leaders like the General Secretary of the UN Water Conference in 1977, Mr. Yahya Mageed, with whom I cooperated a lot in the 1980s. He prepared this table for a Red Cross water scarcity conference we had in Sweden in 1989, where he showed how sub-Saharan Africa is divided in a long series of hydroclimatic livelihood zones from the desert to the left in the diagram and all the way to the rainforest at the right-hand end of the diagram. He compared annual rainfall with wet season evaporative demand. And agriculture is possible only where there is rainwater surplus, and that is beyond 400 to 500 millimeter rain, whereas nomadism is needed where all the rain evaporates. You can see to the left of the red line, we have areas where there is a water deficiency. Evaporation is larger than the rainfall, whereas to the right of the red line, we have an agriculture where there is a water surplus available. And in the former area, the former area is the Sahel region, and what the type of life possible there is nomadism or transhumance, whereas to the right of the red line, that is the Savanna, and there sedentary agriculture is possible. And the rainy season is humid. Here you have a diagram of the Savanna water availability situation. Sub-Saharan Africa is mostly savanna. This is the yellowish, brownish, broad area in the map to the left, with limited rainfall, frequent droughts, and poor soils. To the right in the diagram, you can see a hydroclimate profile all the way from the arid end in the left end of the diagram to the humid region in Central Africa at the right end of the diagram. The blue curve shows you the rainfall, including plus minus 1 standard deviation. And the gray curve shows you the water requirement for a mature crop. So you can see that in the arid and most of the semi-arid regions, there is simply too little rainfall most of the year to allow a full crop. The very limited water available to the roots allow no more than only a very sparse crop. In the dry subhumid zone, the droughts will have a similar effect and complicate agricultural production. In the inverted columns at the bottom of the graph shows the population growth between 2010, 2030, and 2050 for each of these hydroclimatic regions. A very large population is, as you can see, living under these constrained climatic conditions and will already some 30 years from now have grown to the current size of India's population. To produce decent food for this growing population, irrigation would therefore evidently be necessary. The problem is that river water is not really accessible. Here we can see the blue river water reality. Africa is different from Asia in the sense that in Asia, Himalaya keeps pouring rich amounts of river water down over the sub-Indian continent, and the so-called green revolution in agriculture, it was based on irrigated agriculture. In Africa, there is no Himalaya. The rich amounts of rain fall over some 6 isolated mountain areas, the darker blue areas on the map, so-called water towers, where runoff is generated. And that runoff forms large rivers, which mainly go as river corridors across the African drylands towards the sea, or in the case of Okavango, towards the large wetland in the Kalahari. If we now turn to look closer at the sub-Saharan food production, 90% of this agriculture is rain-fed. And as a consequence of the aridity, there is only limited irrigation possible, 5%, and most of the sub-Saharan agriculture is rain-fed subsistence agriculture with very low yields of the order of only 1 ton per hectare. The drought proneness seriously complicates this crop production. Both the interannual droughts, which are getting increasingly both serious and frequent in response to the ongoing climate change, and the frequent dry spells with many days or even weeks without any rain during the rainy season. During such dry spells, the roots get damaged and lose capacity to absorb green water for the production of crop biomass, which has the consequence that the yields get extremely low, typically of the order, as I earlier said, only 1 ton per hectare, of a hydroclimatically possible yield of some 7 tons per hectare. Interannual droughts are increasing in severity. This diagram shows how frequency curves for air temperature for a series of 10-year periods from the 1950s, which is the brownish curve in the middle, till 2010, which is the pink curve to the right-hand end in the diagram. The horizontal scale is standard deviations of the original curve from the 1950s. In other words, how often a certain temperature tended to appear. The vertical axis shows how large area tends to be stricken by the different dry interannual years. And what we can see is that in the 1950s, the brownish curve in the middle, temperatures 3 standard deviations warmer than average. This is the horizontal axis, the number 3, that is 3 standard deviations. In the 1950s, this never happened. The curve doesn't go longer than that. Whereas in the early 2000s, the pink curve shows us that temperature the temperature of 3 standard deviations of the original curve could cover some 10% of the land area. And temperatures more than 4 standard deviations away could in fact now be expected, but didn't exist earlier. So this is an example of the climate change, the way in which it has influenced drought, the interannual droughts. But then we have the other type of droughts, the intra-annual droughts. That is the dry spells during the wet season. Here we can see how frequent are dry spells during the rainy season in the Sahel region. This is data from an article in Ambio. What we see is data from 4 dryland stations with between 400 and 900 millimeter rainfall in the period 1982 to 2006. Each station is shown separately in a set of 5-year sequences. The growing season weeks are shown along the horizontal axis, and the dry spells are shown in gray for each individual year. It is evident that dry spells tend to appear every single year, some years as frequent as 6 periods without any rain during one single growing season. The drought harm done on the crop roots during these droughts can, however, be counteracted by supplementary irrigation with harvested rainfall, a method which has widely been used earlier in the Chinese drylands as well as on Indian rain-fed drylands. The result of these frequent dry spells is very low crop yields. When the crop roots are not able to pick up green water from the soil, the production of biomass is disturbed, reducing the yields from what is hydroclimatically possible, as demonstrated in this a bit complicated diagram, which shows data from a 3-year research study in Niger in the Sahel zone. The diagram is divided in 2 parts. To the left, you have a column where 100% is the crop water requirement in this region. And the diagram shows what happened to the rainfall. As you can see, the average rainfall during these 3 years was 90% of the crop water requirements. And we can see that out of that amount of available rain, some 30% vanished as flood flow. some 20% passed right through the upper soil, percolating down to deeper layers, while only of the order of 35% was available in the root zone. But only if we go to the right-hand diagram, we can see that only 30% of that amount was picked up by the roots, forming transpiration, whereas the rest of the green water was lost by evaporation. The outcome was a yield of only 1 ton per hectare, which we can see from the curved lines which show the potential crop yields in any point in the diagram. And the diagram therefore indicates that without these evaporation losses, a yield of some 7 tons per hectare would have been possible, the green point. An attractive possibility is now to make better use of the rain so it doesn't form great losses. So the next question is if it is possible to reduce these huge water losses typical for the sub-Saharan subsistent agriculture. What we see here is the plant profile and the different water flows. We can see the rainfall, the precipitation. We see the surface runoff loss, which forms surface runoff, 10 to 25% in this case. We see the infiltration through the soil surface. We see the deep percolation in the lower layers of the soil. And we see the 2 types of vapor flows. The large evaporation, which is blue in the diagram, and the constrained transpiration, which is green. What can be done to make better use of the rain is to so-called vapor shift, which is helping the roots to take up more of the water in the root zone, to avoid to get damaged during the dry spells, in other words, by protecting them from drought damage. And this can be done by small-scale irrigation during the dry spells, with rainfall harvested during rainstorms and stored in small local dams. So what I'm saying is that the vertical blue arrow is evaporation losses, which could be used for the plant transpiration, provided that it could be caught by the roots while down in the soil surface. But for this aim, the roots have to be protected from dry spell losses. And there is plenty of evidence that this is possible. And for that aim, the Stockholm Water Symposium, the World Water Symposium every year in Stockholm, we have had a seminar where we have year after year pledged for an African green water revolution in order to make a better agricultural production possible. And we have called this an African water revolution. Is absolutely fundamental for the future of Africa in order to make the food production possible. And this proposal for an African water revolution, it has now been taken up by the African society itself. It is being taken care of by the Office for the Sustainable Development Goals of Africa in Kigali. And it is now going to a meeting of all the different African countries later this winter. Now, core agricultural measures are in order to take care of the water loss and introduce it into crop production is, in other words, one, soil conservation to facilitate for the rain to enter the soil surface, which is often crusted in the sub-Saharan region. And two, to add fertilizers, since the African soils tend to be poor in nutrients. And three, to make the best possible use of the rain by rainwater harvesting in small dams, like the sloughs which are used in Canada, where there is a similar climate. I now come to the next part of my presentation, which looks towards the future, the long-term challenges. One essential challenge in Africa is the population growth. And this diagram shows the population on all the different continents of the world, on the vertical scale, which goes up to 6 billion, against time on the horizontal axis, from 1950 to 2100, 150 years. At the bottom of the diagram, the lowest curves, you can see Europe, Latin America, and North America, which all are foreseen to stay more or less constant at less than 1 billion each. The yellow curve shows Asia, where the population grew rapidly during the second half of the 1900s, as you can see. The pink, which heads toward 5 billion plus minus something around 2050. The pink curve shows Africa, which is now rapidly growing and will by 2050 have doubled its population. And by 2100, possibly have doubled it once more to altogether some 4 billion people. The main factor contributing to this enormous growth is not fertility. The fertility remains high in some 10 countries, but the enormous growth is basically the increase of life expectancy, which means that people are living longer. The number of children per woman is reducing. That's what I'm saying. But the number of grown-ups are increasing in response to growing health. What this population growth means in the dryland zones can be seen in this diagram, which we saw in a smaller version earlier. And we have the population from 2020 to 2030 to 2050. And you can see the sum of the arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid countries, which is growing from 0.7 billion in 2010 to 1.6 billion foreseen for 2050. This is another India in the arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid zones. So this is part of Africa's future that we are trying to prepare for. But we have an additional factor, and that is the climate change. And here you can see this next challenge, as here projected by the Resilience Center in Stockholm, in terms of the change foreseen in annual rainfall up to 2030, the next 12 years. What we can see is there is a general tendency that the north and the west is getting wetter. They are green on the map, while the east and the south is getting even drier. That is the red and pink areas on the diagram. Now, when looking at the future and this huge population growth, we have to see what are the possibilities for the African countries to feed themselves. And I have no calculation of that, but I have an earlier calculation on the global level, which we have made in the Stockholm Resilience Center a couple of years ago in a book that we published. What this diagram shows is that globally, by 2050, due to the large global population growth foreseen in water-poor countries, these countries will have to be prepared to import food to avoid hunger. And the diagram shows you the size of the global population able to produce food surplus. This is the blue areas. They are able to produce a food surplus for export. And the population foreseen in these countries is 3.7 billion. But the rest of the world will not be able to produce surplus, but will depend on import of food from 2050. And these are the green countries. The same size of the population, 3.6 billion. Now, this calculation it's not optimistic. It's an effort to be realistic. So the calculation is based on the water needed for a loss-free minimum diet of only 2,200 kilocalories per person a day. So is the net that the humans need, and with only 5% animal protein. While today, when we discuss population growth, we generally assume 3,000 people per flow unit and 20% animal protein. So we are looking at where is the limit in this calculation. So the blue are those that can export food, the green are those that can import food and pay for that, have foreign currency available thanks to economic development. But we have the red sector left with 1.5 billion, and this is those countries assumed to remain too poor to pay for import, and therefore dependent on other ways to handle the food supply, for instance, by even more reduced diet expectations or an horizontal expansion of croplands into pasture lands or on food aid from abroad. So if we now summarize the green water perspective and the food production outlook in sub-Saharan Africa, crop production is a sector under increasing pressure. The arid climate is the region's Achilles heel, and crop production is for hydroclimatic reasons, highly vulnerable to droughts and dry spells. To strive towards the Sustainable Development Goal number 2 of hunger alleviation in the next 12 years, to the Sustainable Development Goal 2030, this will depend on urgently realizing this African green water revolution that I mentioned earlier, along those lines. And even with the modernized dryland agriculture, dryland countries will, in response to their population growth, however, increasingly depend on food import. The humid tropical zone in Central Africa is, of course, a positive phenomenon and will with time offer interesting possibility as a central food exporter to other African countries and trade partner once their agricultural production has developed. So what I'm saying is that in sub-Saharan Africa, three issues are colliding. In an overall water perspective, with proper attention to both the green water in the soil and the blue water in rivers and aquifers, we note that three main issues are colliding. The first one, the dry climate of the continent with low runoff generation, since most of the rain evaporates in the high temperature, and an ongoing global warming due to climate change, which increases the temperature further in the east and the south of the continent. Number two, the extreme population growth in 90 years only, with most of the additional population expected to live in the megacities, so that another 80 such cities are expected already in the next 10 years and will need water for the water supply and for the industrial production and the energy development. And factor three, the rapidly increasing blue water demands to meet these rising water requirements for exploding urban domestic water supply, industrial water needs to support socioeconomic development, and generation of foreign currency to be able to support a growing food import need with population growth. So summarizing the long-term challenges to meet the future waiting for sub-Saharan Africa during the next 3 decades, while the population is doubling, that's up till 2050, we can distinguish 4 sectors of importance: the food security, the industrial development, the need for land-water integration in the planning, and national level economic planning on the national level. The first one, for food security, a green water revolution will be essential to alleviate the large-scale hunger by modernizing the subsistence agriculture, benefiting from the huge water losses that we looked at earlier, making them productive by taking the way through the root zone and not directly evaporating, and thereby increasing the yields by at least a few tons per hectare, and preparing for a moment in time when food self-reliance will no more be possible, as I showed you on my global study. My second point, the industrial development represents an urgently rising sector of water demand for economic development and international trade. And point 3, since both industry and urban water supply represent 2 sectors with rapidly growing needs of blue water, in other words, river water and groundwater, and energy development also depends on blue water, it will be important to integrate the water resources system in the landscape, to see the green and the blue water at the same time. The green water in the soil, on the one hand, available to the roots, but currently subject to enormous losses, and the blue water in the river system needed for building up water supply system for socioeconomic development. And countries will therefore, at point 4, be wise to build up systems of national level blue-green, integrated national level blue-green water resources planning. And here are my conclusions. Africa's main resource is the rain, which basically falls over the land, where most of it enters the soil and returns to the atmosphere as part of the plant production, but also as evaporation losses, which can be made use of. While limited part of the water generates runoff, mainly in large river corridors, difficult to make use of in the savanna lands, but also as wet season flow in small rivers which go dry during the dry season. The future water policy that Africa needs is to concentrate the dryland agriculture on benefiting from the huge current green water losses, while the blue water is, in the short perspective, needed for water supply of the 80 megacities expected already the next decade, and or the development of industrial production and energy supply. As far as can be seen, however, hydroclimatic food production constraints beyond 2050 will involve the need for a global preparedness, in my understanding, for a massive out-migration from Africa, at least in the second half of this century, if not earlier. Thank you.